Okay, so evolution. You hear that word and you probably think, oh yeah, Darwin, finches, Galapagos, the whole thing. But what if I told you that the story of evolution, of like how we came to understand how life changes over time, what if that story actually goes way, way back, long before Darwin?
You're absolutely right. We often jump straight to Darwin, but there's this whole fascinating world of thought before him, where thinkers were already wrestling with these big questions about how life came to be and how it transformed over time.
And that's what we're diving into today. We're going back in time, exploring these early ideas about evolution. We're going to be like philosophical time travelers, trying to understand the world through the eyes of these early thinkers.
Think of it this way. We're going to be kind of like detectives, piecing together clues from history to understand how these ideas developed and how they ultimately led to Darwin.
And our main guidebook for this trip is this fantastic entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on evolutionary thought before Darwin. It covers like everything from ancient Greece right up to the mid-19th century. It's really remarkable how long these questions have been around.
I mean, it shows you that humans have always been curious about where we come from, how life works, and how it changes. It's a fundamental part of who we are.
Our mission for you, our listeners, to like really get a feel for this pre-Darwinian world of thought, to see how these ideas were shaped by the philosophical and scientific context of their time.
Exactly. We're not just going to throw names and dates at you. We want to dig deeper, explore the different approaches these thinkers took, and uncover some of the surprising and sometimes even controversial ideas they came up with.
Okay, so ready to hop in our philosophical time machine and head back to ancient Greece.
Let's do it. Fasten your seatbelts, folks. We're going way back.
All right, so ancient Greece. It might surprise you to learn that like even way back then, there were hints of evolutionary thinking. We're talking like way before microscopes, genetics, any of that stuff.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing, right? So we've got these guys, Empedocles and the Greek atomists. These are philosophers who were trying to explain the world in terms of basic material components.
Like the building blocks of reality, right?
Exactly. And, they came up with some pretty radical ideas about how life came to be. For example, Empedocles imagined this scenario where the world was initially filled with like random body parts just floating around, and they started combining in different
So
ways.
like arms and legs and heads all just like bumping into each other.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And according to him, only the combinations that actually worked that could function survived.
That's kind of like a very early version of natural selection, right?
In a way, yeah. I mean, he didn't have all the details figured out, but it's this idea that the environment somehow selects for the organisms that are best suited to survive.
Wow, that's pretty advanced for like ancient Greece.
And then you have the atomists. They followed thinkers like Democritus, who believed that everything was made up of these tiny indivisible particles called atoms.
I remember learning about those in chemistry class.
Right. But they weren't just talking about matter, they were talking about life, too. They believed that life arose from the random movements and combinations of these atoms.
So basically, life just kind of popped up out of the chaos of atoms bumping into each other.
That's the general idea. And one of the best articulations of this idea comes from the Roman poet Lucretius. He wrote this amazing poem called On the Nature of Things. And in it, he lays out this beautiful poetic vision of the world arising from the random dance of atoms.
So we're already seeing like this idea of change and even like chance playing a role in how life came to be. But like those ideas kind of went underground for a while, right?
Yeah, for centuries, those ideas were kind of overshadowed by other philosophical frameworks. And, it's important to understand these shifts because they really shaped how people thought about the world, including life and its origins.
Right, because ideas don't just exist in a vacuum. They're always interacting with other ideas and the prevailing beliefs of the time.
Exactly. And one of the biggest shifts came with, some really influential thinkers, Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics. And they brought a very different perspective.
So what was their take on all this?
Well, you see, these guys, they emphasized order, purpose, and design in the natural world. Like, they saw this incredible complexity and beauty in nature, and they believed it pointed to some kind of underlying intelligence or plan.
Okay, so they saw purpose, like a grand design behind everything.
Right. So, for example, you've got Plato, and in his dialogue Timaeus, he presents this whole creation myth. And in this myth, there's this divine craftsman, or demiurgos.
Wait, demiurgos, what is that?
It's basically like a divine being, a creator figure. And this demiurgos fashions the cosmos and all living beings according to these eternal, perfect forms.
Forms.
Yeah, think of them like blueprints. Like there's this perfect form of a horse, a perfect form of a tree, and the demiurgos uses these forms to create the world we see.
Okay, so like the world is a reflection of these perfect blueprints.
Exactly. And this whole idea, it's often called design arguments. They're these arguments that try to prove the existence of God or a designer based on the apparent order and complexity of the natural world.
And so like for Plato, the reason we see such beauty and intricate design in nature is because it's a reflection of these divine forms.
Right. And this idea of externally imposed design, it became incredibly influential in Western thought. It really shaped how people thought about the world, about life, and ultimately about the possibility of evolution.
And then you have Aristotle, Plato's student. He also saw purpose in nature, right? But his take was a little bit different.
Yeah, he had a slightly different philosophical angle. For Aristotle, it wasn't so much about an external designer, but more about an internal drive, like an inherent nature or purpose within each living thing.
So like a built-in blueprint, not an external one.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. He called it susha,
Hmm.
which is often translated as soul or life principle. And this susha, it guides the development and functioning of each organism, pushing it towards its natural end or goal.
Okay, so like an acorn has a suja that drives it to become an oak tree.
Exactly. And Aristotle also believed in this idea of an eternal cosmos. So he wasn't really concerned with the question of a historical origin in the same way that the atomists were.
So if the cosmos is eternal, there's no need to explain how it began.
Right. And this brings us to another key concept in Aristotle's thought, the idea of species, or eidos.
Idas.
Yeah, it's basically the enduring form or essence of a species, like what makes a horse and a dog a dog.
Hmm.
And for Aristotle, these eidos were eternally perpetuated through the generation of like by like.
So like horses always give birth to horses, dogs always give birth to dogs.
Exactly. And he didn't really see this as a problem because he believed that the universe was eternal and that these forms, these eidos, were also eternal. But this becomes really important later on when people start thinking about whether species can actually change over time.
I can see how that would be a sticking point because if species are eternal and unchanging, then the whole idea of evolution just kind of goes out the window, right?
Right. And to make things even more complicated, you have thinkers like Galen, this super influential Roman physician. He argued that the incredible complexity of a human body, all the different organs working together so perfectly, it just screamed design.
So he saw the human body as evidence for a designer.
Precisely. And this really reinforced this whole teleological view, the idea that things in nature have a purpose, that they're designed for a specific end.
Okay, so here we are in ancient Greece. We've got these early atomists with their ideas of change and chance, but then you have these really powerful philosophical arguments for design and purpose in nature. It sounds like we're already seeing this fundamental tension between these two ways of looking at the world.
And this tension, it's going to continue to play out as we move through history. It's a tension between seeing the world as a product of random processes versus seeing it as a product of design, between emphasizing change versus emphasizing stability.
And it's a tension that's still with us today in a lot of ways. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's jump forward a few centuries to the medieval period. All right, time to put on our medieval thinking caps. So what happens in the medieval period that shifts things up?
Well, one of the big things is the rediscovery of Aristotle's works. And I'm talking about a full-on Aristotelian revival. Like suddenly everyone's reading Aristotle, everyone's talking about Aristotle.
It's like the hot new bestseller, but like 1,000 years old.
Yeah, something like that. And remember how Aristotle emphasized this idea of the enduring soulless form, the eidos, as being passed down through generations?
Like the blueprint for each species.
Right. Well, this idea really solidified the notion that species were permanent, that they couldn't fundamentally change. Because if the underlying form was considered eternal, then the species itself must also be eternal.
Okay, I can see how that would reinforce this idea of fixity.
Yeah, and it actually made the idea of extinction really problematic. Like, if a species had an eternal form, how could it just cease to exist? It was a real philosophical head-scratcher.
Right, it challenges the whole framework. So Aristotle's back in the picture, and that really strengthens this idea of species permanence. But at the same time, you have this really strong influence from Judeo-Christian Islamic thought with its own ideas about creation.
Right. This adds a whole other dimension to the conversation because now you have this idea of a divine creator, a God who brought all things into being at a specific moment in time.
So suddenly, there's a beginning, a moment of creation, which is a very different concept than Aristotle's eternal cosmos.
Absolutely. And this immediately raises the question of how do you reconcile these two seemingly conflicting ideas? How do you fit Aristotle's eternal forms into a framework of divine creation?
Right, because if God created everything, then, like, when did he create these eternal forms? It gets a little tricky.
Exactly. And this is where thinkers like Augustine of Hippo come in. Augustine, he was this brilliant early Christian theologian and philosopher, and he came up with this really fascinating idea called rationes seminales.
Rationes seminala.
Yeah, I mean, seminal reasons, or you could think of them like primordial seeds. And Augustine's idea was that God implanted these seeds in creation at the very beginning.
Okay, so it's like God planted these little blueprints for all future life forms at the moment of creation.
Yeah, it's a good way to think about it. And these seeds, they contain the potential for all the different species that would eventually unfold over time.
So it's not like God created each species individually. He just kind of set things in motion with these primordial seeds.
Right. And this allowed for a dynamic element within this divinely ordained framework. It meant that new species could potentially emerge over time, even if their ultimate origin was tied back to God's initial act of creation.
Okay, so that's a pretty clever way to bridge the gap between Aristotle's ideas and a creationist worldview.
It is, and it shows how these thinkers were constantly trying to reconcile different philosophical and theological perspectives to make sense of the world around them.
And then, of course, you have Thomas Aquinas, the big name in medieval philosophy,
Oh.
who tried to synthesize Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology in this really systematic way.
Aquinas is a really key figure here. He engages deeply with Aristotle's ideas while working within a Christian framework. And when it comes to the question of species, he suggests that new species, if they were to appear, actually pre-exist in a potential state.
Potential state.
Yeah, like they're not fully formed yet, but they exist as a possibility within certain active powers that God gave to creation at the beginning. It's a way of trying to harmonize the seemingly fixed nature of Aristotelian forms with the theological possibility of newness within a created order.
Okay, so like the blueprint is there, but it's not fully expressed yet.
Exactly. And it's important to note that Aquinas and other medieval thinkers, they weren't as rigidly essentialist as we often imagine them to be.
Essentialist. What does that mean?
Well, essentialism is this idea that things have these fixed, unchanging essences or properties that define what they are. And while Aristotle and the scholastics certainly believed in essences, they also recognized that there could be variation within a species.
So, like, all dogs share a common essence, but they can still come in different shapes and sizes.
Exactly. And medieval thinkers, they actually debated quite a lot about the nature of species and how much variation was possible within these divinely ordained boundaries.
Interesting. So the picture is a bit more nuanced than just like species are fixed, end of story.
Right. There was this tension between the idea of fixity and the possibility of change, and different thinkers approached it in different ways. But as we move into the early modern period, we're going to see some really significant shifts in thinking that start to challenge this established order even further.
Okay, so let's fast forward to the early modern period. What's shaking things up now?
Well, this is a time of immense intellectual upheaval. You've got the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution. It's a time of questioning old authorities and embracing new ways of looking at the world.
So like a really exciting time for new ideas, right?
Absolutely. And one of the big developments that really challenges the idea of species fixity is the revival of atomism. Remember those ancient Greek atomists we talked about?
The guys with the atoms bumping into each other.
Yeah, those guys. Their ideas, particularly the work of Lucretius, get rediscovered during the Renaissance. And suddenly, you have this alternative philosophical framework for understanding the world, one that emphasizes natural processes, chance, and the possibility of change over time.
So like a direct challenge to this Aristotelian view that had been dominant for so long.
Exactly. And then you have another towering figure who enters the scene, René Descartes.
Ah, Descartes. The I think, therefore I am guy.
That's the one.
Yeah.
Descartes is this huge figure in philosophy and science. He really revolutionizes how people think about the world. And one of his key contributions is this idea of mechanism. He proposes that the physical world, including our bodies, can be understood as complex machines governed by natural laws.
So like the universe is a giant clock and God is the clockmaker.
That's a common analogy used to describe his philosophy. And Descartes, he even tries to apply this mechanical philosophy to explain how the Earth and the solar system formed. He comes up with this whole hypothetical account in his works, Principia Philosophiae and Le Monde.
So he's trying to explain the origins of the universe without relying on supernatural explanations.
Precisely. And that's a really significant shift. But there's a catch.
Oh, it's the cat.
Well, when it comes to living things, particularly the origin of species, Descartes kind of punts. Yeah, like he doesn't really provide a clear explanation. He explores the idea of the body as a machine, but ultimately, he relies on divine creation to explain the initial existence of living organisms.
So he can explain how the universe might have formed naturally, but he still needs God to create life.
Right. And he doesn't really offer a naturalistic explanation for the diversity of life. So while his philosophy revolutionizes physics and astronomy, it leaves this big gap in our understanding of biology.
So it's like he opens the door to thinking about the world in a new way, but then he kind of stops short when it comes to life itself.
Yeah, and this creates a real intellectual opening for other thinkers to try and fill in the gaps.
Right, because if the universe can be understood as a machine, then what about life? Is it also a machine? And if so, how does that machine work?
Exactly. And these are the questions that drive a lot of the scientific and philosophical discussions in the centuries that follow.
So we're kind of at this crossroads. We've got Descartes' mechanical philosophy, but it's incomplete. It can't fully explain the origin and diversity of life. So what happens next?
Well, in the wake of Descartes, we see these two main intellectual trends emerging. One trend focuses on empirical observation, particularly the study of fossils. And Nicholas Steno is a key figure here.
Philo.
Yeah, he was a Danish scientist and Catholic bishop, and he's considered one of the founders of geology and paleontology. He does all this amazing work on fossils, arguing that they're actually the remains of past organisms.
So like he's showing that life on Earth has changed over time.
Right, and he's also arguing that the Earth itself has a history, that it's not static and unchanging as people had previously believed. But Steno, he doesn't really try to explain the origin of these organisms through Cartesian mechanical principles.
So he's providing evidence for change, but he's not offering a mechanism for how that change happens.
Exactly. And then you have this other trend, which is more focused on trying to reconcile a Cartesian-style Earth history with the biblical account of Genesis.
So like trying to square science with religion.
Yeah, that's a big part of it.
Hmm.
And one of the key figures in this trend is Thomas Burnet. He's this English theologian and writer, and he comes up with this whole theory about the Earth's initial state as described in Genesis.
Okay, so he's trying to interpret Genesis in a more literal way.
Right. And to explain the origin of life, he draws on Augustine's idea of a spontaneous fruitfulness of the ground. Remember those primordial seeds?
Ah, so those seeds are back in play.
Yep. Burnet suggests that God created this incredibly fertile earth at the beginning, and from this fertile ground, life just kind of sprang forth spontaneously.
So like life just popping up out of the dirt.
Pretty much. And this is a significant departure from Descartes' more hypothetical approach. Burnet is trying to provide a more literal interpretation of a developmental history that aligns with Scripture.
Okay, so we've got these two trends. Empirical observation of fossils, and this attempt to reconcile a scientific view of Earth history with a religious worldview.
Mm.
But, like, the idea of the world as a machine, that's still a really powerful force in this period, right?
Absolutely. And one of the big questions that emerges is, okay, if the world is a machine, what about life? Can life be explained purely mechanically?
Right, because living things, they seem a lot more complex and dynamic than just a bunch of gears and levers.
Exactly. And this is where the debates surrounding spontaneous generation become really important.
Spontaneous generation, you mean the idea that life can just arise out of non-living matter?
Yeah, like maggots appearing on rotting meat or mice suddenly appearing in a pile of grain. These were common beliefs, and they seem to fit with this idea of a fertile earth where life could just spring forth.
Right, because if God created this super fertile earth, then maybe that fertility includes the ability to produce life spontaneously.
Exactly. And some people even link this back to Augustine's idea of the primordial seeds. Like maybe those seeds are still out there in the environment, just waiting for the right conditions to sprout into life.
But didn't people start doing experiments to test this idea?
Yeah, and those experiments started to cast some serious doubt on the idea of a spontaneous generation, at least for complex organisms. Francesco Redi, an Italian physician, he did this famous experiment where he covered some meat with gauze to prevent flies from landing on it. And guess what? No maggots appeared.
So that showed that the maggots weren't just spontaneously generating out of the meat, they were coming from fly eggs.
Exactly. But while these experiments challenged the idea of spontaneous generation for complex organisms, the idea persisted for simpler life forms like microbes.
Right, because people couldn't see microbes with the naked eye, so it was harder to prove or disprove how they arose.
Exactly. And this is where things get even more interesting because around the same time, you have William Harvey making these groundbreaking discoveries in embryology.
Harvey, the guy who figured out how blood circulates.
That's the one. But he's also famous for his work on embryos. He studied chick embryos and showed that they develop gradually from a simple, undifferentiated egg into a complex organism. And this really challenged the prevailing theories of generation, both the Aristotelian view and the purely mechanistic view.
Okay, so how did Harvey's work challenge those views?
Well, Aristotle believed that the embryo was formed by the male semen acting on the menstrual blood, and that the form, or eidos, was gradually imposed on this matter.
So, like, the form is kind of sculpted out of this raw material.
Right. But Harvey showed that the embryo actually develops from pre-existing structures within the egg.
So it's not just a blank slate.
Exactly. And this also challenged the purely mechanistic view, which suggested that the embryo was just a tiny preformed organism that simply unfolded or grew larger.
Like a little miniature human just waiting to get bigger.
Yeah, and this idea was gaining popularity at the time. It was called preformationism. And it came in different flavors, but the basic idea was that all organisms were preformed from the very beginning, either in the egg or the sperm.
So it's like God created all these tiny little humans, animals, plants, everything all at once, and they're just waiting to be born or to grow.
Right. And this idea, it appealed to people for a few reasons. For one, it seemed to solve the mystery of how a complex organism could develop from a seemingly simple egg or sperm.
Because if it's already preformed, then you don't need to explain how all the different parts come together.
Exactly. And it also aligned nicely with theological ideas about a perfect initial creation. Like God created everything perfectly at the beginning, and it's just been unfolding ever since.
Right, so no need for ongoing creation or for any messy, random processes.
Precisely. But this preformationist view, it ran into some problems.
Like what?
Well, for starters, it couldn't really explain things like heredity, variation within a species, or the existence of hybrids. Like, if everything was preformed, then how could offspring inherit traits from both parents? And how could there be so much diversity within a species if everyone was basically just a copy of a preformed miniature?
Yeah, those are pretty big problems. It seemed like a very rigid view of life.
It is. And some thinkers at the time, they recognized these problems. George Garden, a Scottish physician, he pointed out that the known laws of motion couldn't really explain how these intricate preformed organisms could actually be formed in the first place.
So, like, the physics of it just didn't add up.
Right. And there were other thinkers, like Benoit de Maillet, who proposed more radical ideas, like the possibility of sea creatures gradually transforming into land animals over vast stretches of time.
So, like a very early version of evolution.
Yeah, kind of. But these ideas were definitely outliers at the time. Preformationism remained the dominant theory for a while, and it really solidified this notion of fixed species with their origins tied directly to divine creation.
Okay, so we've come a long way. We've gone from ancient Greek atomism to this idea of species fixity reinforced by preformationism. But it feels like we're on the cusp of some really big shifts in thinking.
We are. The 18th century is a real turning point. You have all these new ideas about matter, about embryology, about the vastness of geological time. And these ideas, they start to chip away at this idea of a static, unchanging world.
So, like, the stage is being set for a more dynamic historical view of life.
Exactly. And Newtonian ideas, they play a really complex role in this shift.
Newton, the gravity guy.
The one only. Newton's ideas, they were revolutionary, but they could be interpreted in different ways when it came to understanding life. On the one hand, you have some thinkers who saw Newton's concept of active forces operating in nature as supporting a more vitalistic view of life.
Vitalistic.
Yeah, the idea that there's this special life force or energy that distinguishes living things from non-living matter. And this vital force, it could explain how organisms develop and function in ways that couldn't be reduced to simple mechanical laws.
Okay, so Newton's ideas could be used to support this idea of a life force.
Right. But on the other hand, you have other thinkers who interpret Newton in a more strictly mechanistic way, arguing that even life could be explained purely in terms of physical laws.
So, like, two very different ways of reading Newton.
Exactly. And this tension between vitalism and mechanism, it's going to continue to play out in the debates about evolution.
It's like this ongoing philosophical struggle to understand what life is and how it works.
Right. And in the 18th century, you have this broader intellectual climate that starts to move away from this purely mechanistic worldview.
So what's driving this shift?
Well, you have several things happening. First, you have this growing recognition of the vastness of geological time. Geologists are starting to realize that the Earth is incredibly old, far older than anyone had previously imagined. And this opens up the possibility for really significant changes to occur over long periods.
Right, because if there's enough time, then even slow, gradual processes can lead to big changes.
Exactly. And then you have new developments in embryology that start to challenge the idea of preformationism. People are starting to observe the embryo developing in more detail, and they're realizing that it's not just a miniature version of the adult organism. It's going through these really complex transformations.
So like the embryo is actually developing, not just unfolding.
Right. And this suggests that there are these dynamic processes at work, that life is not just a static, predetermined thing.
Okay, so we've got a deeper appreciation for geological time and a more dynamic view of embryology. What else is contributing to this revitalizing of nature, as our source puts it?
Well, there's also this increasing interest in dynamic theories of matter. Remember how Newton introduced the idea of active forces operating in nature? Well, some thinkers start to take this idea and run with it, suggesting that matter itself might be inherently active, possessing a kind of inner dynamism.
So like matter isn't just this inert stuff. It's got some kind of internal energy or force.
Exactly. And this idea, it's really important because it opens up the possibility for matter to self-organize, to form complex structures without the need for an external designer.
So like maybe life isn't the result of God putting all the pieces together. Maybe it's something that can emerge naturally from the properties of matter itself.
Right. And this is a really radical idea at the time. It challenges the whole design argument that had been so influential for centuries.
Okay, so we've got these really exciting developments happening in geology, embryology, and our understanding of matter. And all of this is creating a more dynamic historical view of nature.
And into this intellectual ferment, you have figures like Pierre-Louis Maupertuis and Georges-Louis Leclerc, Comte de Buffon. These guys, they're really crucial in challenging preformationism and laying the groundwork for more explicit evolutionary ideas.
Okay, let's start with Maupertuis. What was his contribution?
Well, Maupertuis, he was a French mathematician and philosopher, and he's one of the first to really critique preformationism in a serious way. He argues that the idea of preformed organisms just doesn't make sense, that it can't explain how traits are inherited from both parents.
Right, because if the offspring is just a miniature version of one parent, then where do the other parent's traits come from?
Exactly. And Maupertuis, he proposes this alternative idea that the embryo develops gradually from a mixture of particles from both parents.
So, like a blending of traits.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. And he suggests that there are these internal modifying powers that guide the arrangement of these particles, shaping the development of the embryo.
So it's not just random chance. There's some kind of internal direction or force.
Right. And this shift in embryology, it's really important because it opens up the possibility of historical change. If the embryo is not preformed, if it's actually developing over time, then maybe species can also change over time.
Right, because now you have this idea of organization happening over time, which is a key concept for understanding evolution.
Exactly. And Maupertuis, he even speculates that new species might arise through random variations in these modifying powers.
So he's hinting at the idea of random mutations.
In a way, yeah, but he doesn't really develop this idea fully.
Okay, so Maupertuis is starting to chip away at preformationism and hint at some evolutionary ideas. What about Buffon? He's a big name in natural history.
Buffon is a really fascinating figure. He's a French naturalist, and he becomes the director of the Jardin du Roi, which was this incredibly important center for scientific research in Paris.
So, like, he's got a lot of clout, a lot of influence.
He does. And he's also very philosophically astute. He's aware of all the big debates of his time, the debates between Newtonians, Cartesians, Leibnizians, and he brings this philosophical sophistication to his study of nature.
So he's not just a naturalist, he's a philosopher of nature.
Exactly. And one of the things that sets Buffon apart from his contemporaries is his emphasis on physical truth.
Physical truth.
Yeah, he's really committed to basing his natural history on observable, repeatable phenomena. He wants to understand how things actually work in the real world, not just speculate about abstract ideas.
So, like, He's a real empiricist, a scientist in the modern sense.
Right. And this commitment to physical truth, it leads him to develop a new methodology for natural history.
What's so new about his methodology?
Well, unlike Linnaeus, who's primarily focused on classifying organisms based on their shared characteristics, Buffon wants to understand living beings in relation to their material conditions and their history. He wants to know how they reproduce, where they live, how they interact with their environment.
So, like, he's